Welcome once again to the second episode of Chronicles of Arcanis, where I'm taking a look at my favorite campaign setting that was created at the beginning of the 21st century by Paradigm Concepts of Miami, Florida. As I discussed, I am friends from down there when I lived for about a decade in Miami, and that was my gaming circle, included people like Henry and Pedro. My initial gaming experience actually wasn't with D&D with them. It was a vampire LARP of all things. But there was still that day where, one time outside of the local gaming store there, Henry's telling me about this idea and this thing he's putting together and how things are changing in the industry. And the next thing I know, man, he's rolling out, he publishes a couple of home adventures, the Spiro Logan, and then there was a follow-up. And then out comes Living Arcanis. Now, as I discussed in the previous episode, we talked about the RPGA, what it was, and I know that things have changed, but it was definitely at a convention like Origins and even Gen Con, within a few years, there was the Arcanis effect, where it had become so popular, especially the big events like Battle Interactives, that it wasn't worth running tables during those time slots for the regular RPGA. Now, what my experience is that most people actually got into Living Arcanis through the RPGA. So what I've been doing is reaching out to the people that I remember from the very beginning of the Living Arcanis in the RPGA, who were regular commentators. We had a Yahoo group, remember those? LA Talk, where all we did was talk about Living Arcanis, and then, we had all of our little subgroups for all the various other things. One of those early posters, regular person by name, and as those things always go, you'd never know who they look like until you run into them. So we actually met probably at one of the early big conventions, but since then, of course, I stepped away. I'm coming back. So what I would like to do is introduce you to Matt Riecks. Matt was a regular contributor to the Living Arcanis Yahoo chats. And so I want him to tell us, how did he discover Living Arcanis, and tell us about your character.
Well, I'm happy to be here. For my part, I also came to Arcanis through the RPGA. Denver, where I'm based, had a very active Greyhawk and Living Force contingent. And my ex-wife and I were very active with the Living Force scene here. We found ourselves, when that campaign was wrapping up in about 2004, in a prime position to jump into Arcanis. We had a number of friends from Force who were active players, and a lot of them were recruiting people into the campaign. So we got in right about the advent of year two, right after the year of Ill Harvest wrapped up.
Okay.
And so we probably had about 2 tables worth of players jump in on Arcanis and start eating up every adventure we could find. We shotgunned through everything that had been published and put out. We've got 2 local conventions at that time dedicated to tabletop RPGs, Genghis Khan and Tacticon. And so we were running probably a slate of about 3 or 4 adventures per weekend when those rolled around, and then introductory adventures as well for recruiting. And we probably got somewhere up to like 20, 25 players in the Denver scene at its height.
Wow.
And we were hosting a monthly game night, Friday night Arcanis, FNA, or,
Sure.
Thursday night Arcanis, TNA.
Did you know the Evansville group? Because I gotta say, I thought they were the largest regular group of Arcanis players that I knew of, but I don't think they regularly put together more than 3 tables.
I think we were roughly comparable. I do know a bunch of the Evansville group. Like, I've played with them, in the interim and especially at the larger cons. But I would say, active roster of engaged players. We often had 2 to 3 tables on our monthlies. We had a couple of big like weekend in the Shattered Empires events,
Mm-hmm.
and like Henry came out as a guest of honor at one of our Genghis Cons. So
That's awesome.
like
That's
we
great.
ran a bunch of the specials, in
Mm-hmm.
second run. The Battle Interactives were a huge draw.
For people who don't know or have never met Henry, when I think the word stentorian voice, is that
Hmm.
a good description?
Yeah,
He
yeah, I would definitely go for gregarious as well.
he definitely has a storytelling voice of authority. And again, he's the creator of the entire mythology. So, as we used to say early on, story time with Uncle Henry.
Mm-hmm.
You go to a con, and at some point, he's going to tell you what's going on. And he definitely does a great presentation. I would say that's always been one of the big draws to all of their fundraisers. Their Kickstarters always include an opportunity to play at one of his tables.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. As a guest of honor, that's a really great opportunity to reach out to a new community. And, it's great you guys did that.
Yeah.
So, what's your Arcanus community like right now?
And we've got a group of about 6 or 7 players currently. We've got the table that sort of banded together when we had the advent of ARG.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us have been playing everything that comes along. You'll often see us as a group at the big events.
Mm-hmm.
Is at this point we've been as invested in these characters for even longer than we were the initial Coriani Civil War arc.
Hmm. Yeah, it's been a while
So,
since the ARG. That was fourth edition. That's really when I stepped out. I mean, I supported them on Kickstarter as the ARG came out, but I was focusing on my culinary career at the time.
yeah, I
Well,
would say probably about half of the local player base, kind of fell off or, pursued other D&D related things, you know.
so let's go back to the first big story arc, the Coriani Civil War. Tell us about your character. Tell us why you played what you played and what went down. What was the story arc of whom?
So my character has a bit of a history, can kind of be considered a little controversial in some ways, but he was a member of the Mourners in Silence.
Explain that, please.
Yes. So I don't know if you've gotten into the topic of secret societies.
Nope, you are
Um,
broaching it for the first time.
so one of the very intriguing aspects of Arcanus, to me at least, is the meta organizations that exist within the campaign for the players. Sometimes, they can have political affiliations, religious affiliations, or other, somewhat more nefarious intents. In the case of the Mourners in Silence, it's a demi-political faction that believes that the gods of Anara have abandoned mankind for our misdeeds, and we are left to make our own fortunes in the world. And the character that I came up with, Reagan Wrath, is a Darkkin
Blame the
who,
Darkkin.
well, I thought the Darkkin was a particularly interesting race. When we were getting into it, we were told that Arcanus was particularly challenging, particularly deadly,
Mm-hmm.
and we might want to build something a little on the hardier side. Darkkin having a con bonus from the racial stats was appealing, and I thought that there was, some things that I could do, with the character that would be a little more interesting.
Real quick, because one of the things I've been focusing on about why Arcanus is such an amazing setting and why PCI really kind of are these behind the scenes trendsetters. Were Tieflings a player race when Darkkin came out?
They were not. Uh,
Exactly.
in
Exactly.
3.5 or third
So,
edition, it was, I love how Arcanus puts its own spin on, existing races, what they did with the elves, what they did with the dwarves,
yeah,
all
we did.
the
We talked about elves. Peter Parker played a Kilakine who hated humans,
Mhm.
and
Well,
wouldn't
so
refuse to fight the Battle of Samar against the Malfellans when he found out his table was headed to that direction. And he looked at all the Malfellans and he said, "I gotta go. I can't stay."
right.
He left. And then he went to the table. He went to the judge's table, went up to Henry and Peter and said, "Look, this is what went down." And they just found another table for him to sit at
Mhm.
that was more appropriate for him to fill in.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about Darkkin. I alluded to they are really what inspired I think, making Tiefling a player character race, but I still believe they were a better concept.
Yeah. Well, in the lore, the, vast storied histories, the very rich history of Arcanis, you had the Time of Terror, which was a period where, devils and infernals roamed the continent after a divine rebuke of the Sorcerer King, if I recall.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It
but
was the Sorcerer King stepped
on
onto
the continent,
Onara onto the shore, and he had been cursed by the Morantian
yep,
whatever kings that they had, the Necro Kings or whatever they were.
yeah. So while these demons, devils, and infernals were, roaming the countryside, they weren't just picking flowers, so to speak, and
Correct.
left plenty of genetic material around behind,
Hmm.
so to speak. And as lineages go, that may fade over time. That half demon in the family history, becomes a genetic throwback. But Darkkin are the misbegotten results of that. They could
Hmm.
be a Darkkin child born to human parents, could be any variation of that, and they are shunned as outcasts and the downtrodden, the vile offspring of someone's dark pact long ago.
So let's talk a little bit more about the comparison with the tieflings. I mean, I look at the tiefling in the fifth edition, and I'll be honest, I'm not impressed as compared to the Arcanus Darkkin, the original version, with the ability to modify and really like fine tune those demonic and devil traits. My Darkkin character was for the Nishampur character.
Mhm.
And my idea was that he was a bouncer type, and I called him Jaws, and he looked like a were shark in essence, in some sort of, Krynos form, kind of hybrid form. And so the skin was able to be shark skin, and he had big giant teeth and able to take a bite. That was his, you know, it,
Yeah.
and there were so many other ways that you could fine tune it. So
Well,
what was your character? Tell us about the fine tunes and the customizations.
my character, Reagan Rath, was a rogue, sneak thief, assassin type. As the rule set built out, he went through several iterations, finally setting on Twilight Champion, which is the holy champion of Kadic.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually part of a two-player set. My ex-wife, who I'd mentioned previously, played the brother of my character, Cress Wrath. And as things go, we sort of stylized ourselves as the Wrath of Kadic and the Wrath of Hurian.
Okay.
So they were kind of a yin yang sort of build. They were both obviously Darkkin, but Reagan's infernal taint was much less pronounced. It was very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Just, darkened eyes, pale skin, and he had the inherent dark vision trait. His
Well, there
second,
were and there were, penalties to animal handling and
right.
animals being around you. There were ways that even though you may have been minimally expressing your tainted blood, there were game mechanics absolutely that were expressed.
And Kim's character leaned fully into that. Poor Cress was fully afflicted with demonic traits. And as we got the Darkkin rulebook, there were
Mhm.
feats that you could take to like further enhance that all the way
Yeah, those
up.
were great.
So, like building out a prehensile tail, getting wings, the wings at higher tiers became functional.
That's what I was doing. Everything was, I wanted, the bite to get worse, to get
Mhm.
bigger, the ability to build on those traits. They began to make me think about ways to build paragon races, right? Which is
Yeah.
what they did when they got to ARG. They said, all right, well, let's say you want to be the most darkiniest darkkin, you can do that. If you want to be the most dwarfy dwarf, you can do that. So tell us
With
about Reagan. So yeah, let's finish up.
So with Reagan, the infernal trait that I gave him was there was a soul shard background trait that basically it was called the devil inside. At some point, when Beltine was, sifting through the cauldron, ladled out Reagan's soul, there was a small part of an infernal soul like clinging to it. So this will come into play further on, but it came to pass that even though Reagan would have good intentions with his actions, there was still that sort of underlying corruption that could make them slightly darker. But as a sneak thief, assassin, rogue type, he considered himself somewhat of a political dissident. This would evolve over time, but at the time that we were getting into the campaign, I was 24 and kind of going through my edgelordy phase.
Okay.
So, he was kind of an edgelord, as we all do have
I've
at
got one
times.
of those. Absolutely. I have an
And
edge PC from way back.
but he wanted to play the game on different terms. He was kind of an anti-hero type that, wanted to promote the elevation of Darkkin in the world by,
Okay.
he really bristled at the Val-centric power structures and, thought that Darkkin never got proper due. And part of that was in umbrage to his brother because Cress, though afflicted with the worst of the demonic traits, was the most noble soul, the
Mhm.
most self-effacing. He was a barbarian that would just charge in to protect the innocent, and he was everything that Reagan was not necessarily. Valorous, courageous, kind-hearted, and Reagan at the outset was just bitter, and he thought it was the biggest injustice that someone so good could be treated so terribly by the world, and he wanted to change that by undermining the powers that be, so to speak.
And that's an important part, I think, of the setting, is that there are all of these moral and ethical challenges. I mean, I got to tell you, I don't think Arcanus could be released today. That
Mm,
people would freak out, that there's a lot of racial, ethnic tension.
mhm.
There's definitely the Koreani Empire's casual use of slavery. This is why I think it's important for people to not only understand that it's a great setting,
Mhm.
but it's a mature setting
Yeah,
and it's for mature players. It's
yeah,
for people who are at least past the murder hobo stage.
yeah.
And you can be in your grim, dark stage of gaming and enjoy Arcanus, but you can't be a murder hobo. You're just
No,
not
no.
going to enjoy the game.
I mean, that was one of Henry's big rules, was he wanted people to be heroes, act the part of heroes however they deemed fit. For
I
my
think
part,
they were
Reagan was.
also the first that I came across that, especially early on, they were some of the first adventures that if you got into combat, you lost. Actually, you did not succeed.
Oh, they
In the
pulled
end, you
not.
may have thought you succeeded because you won the combat, but in the end, no, your actions have consequences. And it was meta into the whole campaign.
Oh yeah, and well, that was one of the big draws of secret societies, is you could put, people at cross purpose. I had a number of times where, I achieved the goal of my, benefactors, and still felt pretty icky about it. Um, I remember there was one time where we had a character death at the table, and we were in a dark, like far removed ruin, seeking some MacGuffins for our patrons, and we were supposed to send the MacGuffin back to them with a sending stone. We'd been given this player died. We had no way of raising them, and my particular faction's goal was to make sure that the MacGuffin didn't get back, like that they stayed lost to history. In the process, I stole this sending stone and just discarded it somewhere along the path. So when we actually achieved our goal, we had no way to send the stuff back, including this character, because the theory was if we send their body back with the MacGuffin, they could be raised and restored. That was an unfortunate circumstance, and I feel kind of bad about that, but
Well, so explain why. So this is we're talking first year story arc, the Civil War stuff. We're not worried about spoilers. So go ahead, man. Tell us the details. Like, what
okay.
horrible, terrible thing did you do?
So
And what were the repercussions of your actions?
so it became increasingly clear over time that the mourners in silence were servants of the voiceless ones, the silence, the forces of entropy that are coming to destroy everything. A lot of these, little side missions or, sneaky stuff, started rather benign. In this case, what we had been sent to was an old Elori fortress that was used to train their Suramars, the, Psi warriors, the anti-psionic Elori special forces in essence. And what we found there was a bunch of shields that would protect people against psionic monstrosities.
So when the
The,
battle against the Il Juan happened later,
actually, this was post Il Juan, but
was
yeah,
it?
I think
Oh,
so.
okay.
But the
Okay.
Coriani wanted these shields. The Allori wanted these shields. As it turned out, there were, both sides got sending stones and, solicited the party to go and find these things, send them. And the quandary was supposed to be, who do we send them to?
Right.
In essence, the way it plays out is you find enough that both sides can be satisfied if they have the means to receive the stones.
Mm-hmm.
As it happened, the stones went missing and nobody got their shields from my table. And our poor party member that died never made it back to civilization to be raised. But the mourners accomplished their task.
Mm-hmm. And so usually what they do, so people understand how well they run these campaigns, the paradigm will collect the data
The
from
critical events
tables, the critical events, and then they're looking for a threshold. And if these certain thresholds aren't met, then certain events don't happen. So if enough tables don't collect in total X number of shields per tables played, then it ends up as part of lore. Either somebody didn't get it, nobody got it, so one table like you where nothing is sent out could actually
have an
change the
impact.
balance.
We'll get to something about that later because one of the funny things about Reagan is he actually became an NPC later. I didn't get to play him out through the entirety of the Coriani arc.
Oh, well, tell us how we got to that point.
So, end of year 4 or 5, before we go into the last year of the campaign arc.
So first of all, so this is the Coriani Civil War. What side were you on?
His own side, but
So
mostly the rebels.
I was going to say, so where did you participate during the battle interactives?
So, the Battle of Solanas Moor, we were on the defender side.
Okay. Yeah. Oh man, I love
Oh,
that. I destroyed people, man. I was a DM for that. That was a lot of fun.
we had a great table. You may know John Deeg from Australia,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
one of the other Invisible Kings. We organized a full table of Darkkin. Like we wanted to stand out. We wanted to plant our flag, say we are here. We are committed to improving the reputation of Darkkin in the setting. One of our strategies was, since all being Darkkin, we could employ magical darkness at will,
Right.
because we could all see in it without penalty. It was a good plan. What we couldn't account for was the GM that we received. I'm not going to name names, but this
Oh no,
person
name
was,
name.
no, it's not fair to them. But they spent all of the time they should have had prepping for the Vel Interactive, playing off slot the night before so they could level their character to get the peak tier rewards for running the event. And as such, was terribly ill prepared for what we were doing. We didn't make it through like the
So
first 2 encounters on time merits alone.
I want to interrupt here because this brings up something that was really, this is one of the things that I talked about in the previous episode with Peter, is that I really take seriously. Well, this is what we were talking about. He says the whole problem with a lot of these games right now is that nobody ever dies, right? I go, yeah, yeah, I understand. And in particular, when you go to these big tables, you go to these big events, because as a dungeon master, as a game master, running those tables, I'm thinking to myself, because I primarily do Origins and Gen Con,
Yeah.
that these folks have spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to come here. And then I'm not prepared.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not ready to run the table. No. And I'll tell you that to me, this was the defining, like, why I will never again, never, never. I mean, I was prepared, but it was like it absolutely hammered it home.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you remember the guy who had cystic fibrosis?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So, I DM'd his last table
Oh
ever.
wow. Yeah.
And knowing that I was prepared, that as much as he was struggling, him and his friends had a great time. And that was at that Battle Interactive that I was
Yeah.
just like, this guy loved gaming, loved Dungeons and Dragons and Arcanus so much that That's what he did. He was struggling for breath,
Yeah.
but he loved it because of the camaraderie. He loved, I wish I could
The
remember his
community was
character.
awesome.
Yeah, it's one of the best gaming communities. It's the only gaming community that I was involved in before I stepped away in 2010, where the good fun, bad fun edition wars was not an issue. We talked about how do we just play better Arcanus.
And we were all largely committed to the story. I mean,
Mhm.
we may have different dogs in the fight, but telling a good story was the heart of it.
Hmm.
You know,
And actually
because
participating in the campaign,
yeah,
not showing up, all right, so Reagan has his own agenda.
being a deuter antagonist and anti-hero, it was more in interest of making the story interesting
Mhm.
than trying to win at D&D.
Right. So how did he become an NPC?
So over the last couple of years of basically the secret was out, the mourners are bad. How can you justify being a mourner? And even though a lot of people had no proof in game, like I would sit down at a table and everybody's like, "Oh, don't trust him. He's a mourner." It's like you have no.
I remember. Oh, wow. I remember reading this. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. Go on, go on, go on, go on.
Yeah, and
Yeah, that's metagaming. It was like, come on, man.
it actually became a thing that there was one player that decided for himself that he was going to try and play at every table I was at because he was an inquisitor. He was Inquisition of the Holy Church, dedicated to rooting out and ending the mourners. So we get to the end of that like year 4, year 5 arc, and we find ourselves on the dark moon of Arcanis.
See, I
This
missed
is
that. I'm gone by then. So tell me about the Dark Moon, man.
so it's this vast gray wasteland of like bones. I believe it was like the Citadel of Neroth. And we'd been sent there for something to, I forget what. But what we find was one of the biggest secrets in all of Arcanis, which was the imprisoned head of a pantheon of gods that existed before the gods of man arrived on Onara. This
Law.
this giant crystalline being called the Haramia just chained to this obelisk and imprisoned there. He tells us the secret lore of how the gods of man came to Onara, were welcomed, and then slaughtered his entire pantheon and imprisoned him for all of eternity. It's in this moment that Reagan gets a psychic directive from his higher ups:
Mm-hmm.
free this guy.
Wow.
Yeah. So the mechanics of this were particularly dicey. You had to have a certain holy weapon that, shines like the sun in order to break his bonds, the Gladius of Light.
Yep, yep. Which were like Bob, I mean, from the very, very beginning, and everybody's like, look, man, you can do whatever you want. Nothing happens. What's this for?
Yeah.
And you happen to have one?
I didn't.
Oh.
I wasn't trusted with one by many people. However, my wife's character did.
Uh-oh.
So what ensued was a chaotic PvP table. We
So
had to
what
stop it.
convention was this at? Where was this?
This was Origins.
Okay.
I want to say about 2008.
Okay.
But they had to stop the adventure, go get Sean Molly, who was the head of the campaign rules staff
Yep.
at the time, to come adjudicate this canon PvP event.
Mm-hmm.
So I steal the Gladius of Light, start, trying to, free this guy. The Inquisitor at the table is trying to stop me. My wife's character is trying to stop this Inquisitor from killing me, not knowing what side to commit to.
Mm-hmm.
It's
That's
a real
awesome.
dicey situation.
Classic. So this is part of what Arcanus is to me, kind of the heart. So people think they look back at classic literature, which Henry is a big fan of, and you can tell just from talking to him and what he was inspired by. And that people think that tragedy just means terrible things happen. That's not what tragedy is in classic literature.
No.
Tragedy is when there are two good solutions and bad things happen no matter which one you choose.
Right.
That's what tragedy in the classic sense means. And there you were.
Hmm.
What other campaigns do that?
Yeah. I think the tragedy here was truly my wife's character, Cress.
That's what I'm
was
saying.
forced to choose between the brother that he loved and defended his entire life and the terrible things he might be capable of.
Correct. Correct.
So combat plays out. I eventually shatter the last bond, and this elder being just snaps his fingers and stops time. Saunters on towards the exit and turns back, looks at Reagan and says, "You've done me a service. What can I provide you?" I kind of knew that playing Reagan was going to be untenable after this point. So I look at him and I say, "I want to see how it all ends."
Oh,
I can't take credit. I'm kind of cribbing a line from Spike at the end of Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
okay.
but it seems very poetic.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see how it ends. That was perhaps not the best choice of words in retrospect
yeah.
because canonically he got transported to the very end of time.
That's what I was exactly what I figured was going to happen.
Yep, the final battle between the Silence, the forces of Oblivion, and the Pantheon of Man.
Hmm.
This will lead into the character's resurgence in fifth edition.
Yeah. So how did it that work? So now we have fifth edition. We went through dark times of the fourth edition and the expulsion from the RPGA and the creation of their own living campaign, which they have continued to put out hard points and soft points. There are story arcs that have continued that over the last, now 2 decades.
Yeah,
There's this huge amount of content for new players. You can start now. That year of Ill Harvest is available. You
yep.
can start with So
You got
Shall
the
You Reap.
codex.
You too can, well, no, we spoiled it. You can't get Skiz, but
Mhm.
I didn't know. So it turns out Peter had Skiz, and as a mage, he was able to get him as an enhanced familiar.
Yeah,
And then in the end, as he's in some battle, out leaps Skiz, fully transforming into a valid
Valinor of
Sulaway.
Sarish. Yeah,
Who was it? I thought it was Sulaway.
I thought it was Sarish, but I might be
I don't
wrong.
know. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
he had it.
yeah.
Whatever. You can watch the previous episode and
Hmm.
he'll tell you because it was his. Yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think this is what makes Arcanus so special is that players leave what is it? Heroes leave their mark on shattered empires,
Hmm.
and really, really do. Like
Oh yeah.
both of those examples, Skiz and what you just described, there were these really bizarre search from the very beginning of the whole thing, and then down number, all of a sudden, this is the key to everything.
Yeah. I no longer have, the character packet, the full binder that was Reagan because I gave it to campaign staff and they were like, we might bring him in and kill him at some point,
Hmm.
as an NPC in adventure. You're okay with that, right? Like he belongs to you now. He is now a part of your story. And
Yeah.
there was like a year 5 or 6 hard point where players wound up at the end of time and found what's his name, the harvester from Omens, the antagonist, like
The
strung up
dwarf,
as a puppet.
the wine drinker from the very.
Yeah, well, the one that had been, undercover as part of the sanctum, like
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Right. I know, I
the
know.
big
Theron
figurehead.
or something like that.
Yeah. So in this, end year hard point, they're at the end of time, and he turns up like transmuted into a puppet,
Hmm.
and that could have been Reagan, but there was no context given. Like I didn't know like what their intentions were. But
Okay. So first off, the fifth edition player's handbook. All right. So fifth edition is coming out. They have to
Mhm.
come up and revamp.
And that's when
Um,
I used the Kickstarter option to bring forward a character from the past.
all right.
So this Kickstarter, gave Reagan a new lease on life. And basically I've got a full story cert from Pedro basically saying you blink and you're on a massive battlefield watching the gods fighting the forces of oblivion, and holy shit, the gods actually are real. They do exist. They have not abandoned existence. And in the midst of that, Larissa like notices you're not supposed to be here.
Hmm.
This is not where you're supposed to be. Literally picks the character up, drops him in the labyrinth of prophecy,
Mm-hmm.
And in the midst of this, like Reagan is struck blind and got slightly mad. So what follows is a incoherent scrabble through the labyrinth of time, to which point he finds himself returned to Onara on the streets of Old Corian, you know, at the place that was most meaningful to him, which was the Vale of Shu
Oh.
in Old Corian.
Mm-hmm. From the old Corian adventure book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Non-canonically, Reagan had a thing for T.A. Kiftu, the proprietress of this. Fast forward, Reagan is a blind beggar, mad, well, half mad, babbling on the streets, and gets taken in and restored somewhat, kind of. Basically, the way that he perceives time is all blended together. So there's a lot of memories and misremembering and everything like stacked on each other,
Mm-hmm.
which in retrospect is really fucking hard to play. But
So where is he now in the timeline? Is he in so
he is in
current
the current
year
he
is
is in the
what?
current year, 40 years from the end of the Koreani Civil War.
Wow.
He is a man out of time, out
Mm-hmm.
of his mind, and
And now he's wandering around saying, the gods are real. The gods are real. I have seen. I believe.
he's
End is near.
as a holy champion of Kadic, he's now trying to use his skill set to redeem
All
the
right. Fifth
misdeeds that.
edition question now. So you brought up the holy champion. I waited till we got to it again. So explain, what's a holy champion of Kadic? What
Well,
does
we
that
don't
mean?
have paladins. We've got a whole lot of different paladins. There's the 12 deities of the pantheon of man, 13 really, but each section of the church has its specific order of champions, holy warriors trained in that particular set of faith.
The dogma of a particular church. So, just so people who are learning and thinking about joining the campaign, so the pantheon of man originally was worshipped as an entirety, and the priesthood were functionaries for every god. There have been many, many cataclysms as the
Schisms.
title, well, as the cataclysms across the world, as it's known as shattered empires, and there were periods like the time of terror that was mentioned when there were demonic forces, infernal forces all across the lands. During these times, the church finds itself isolated, and little places will say, hey, we just worship Kadic because Kadic has kept us safe and the Cadacian church has kept us safe. We see areas where there are syncretic combinations, like in some of the more furthest reaches of the provinces. So each god of the pantheon of man is currently worshipped as an individual deity, but those change now how they're worshipped from Koryani, where everyone is worshipped individually, to I'll ask you to explain what happened in Millendeer. And of course, there's Canceri, where the primary worship is only
The Dark Triumvirate.
the Dark Triumvirate. Nair, who is the raging fire of wrath and warfare. And then you have Neroth, who's the god of death and the
Rebirth.
rebirth of the physical self.
Hmm.
And then Sarish, who is magic, binding of demons, blood magic,
Kadic being the god of shadows, music, holy murder.
holy murder.
Well,
I know that's
be-
this is what I'm talking about. Arcanist.
being
This
the
is a
dark hand of
mature.
Ilir, he does the ill deeds that keep the head of the gods' hands clean.
Mhm.
So, it's very much in line with, sort of Reagan's worldview to, make the hard call, do the pragmatic thing that people may not agree with for the
Well,
greater good.
remember in the movie Dogma, the Loki character? That's what he was. He was death and destruction.
Yeah.
That's Kadic. He's the
You,
Loki character. That's all. So what does a holy champion of Kadic, what makes them so special?
Well, their domain is primarily shadows and darkness. Kadic is the lord of the shadow realm. So some of their specific abilities, involve like stepping through the shadow realm or, having access to little pockets of it. And I can cast spell darkness and, work in the shadows better than most.
So you
But
have, let's get into the mechanics real quick. D what for hit points?
I believe it's a D10.
Okay. So this is, very much the clone. At what level do you gain spell casting?
Third, I
Right.
believe.
Okay.
It's been a while.
Yeah, yeah, but it's very much, straightforward paladin clone with a customized spell list.
Yeah,
So what
different
what are
class
you doing
abilities.
now? What's he up to these days?
Mostly just, adventuring. I haven't had a chance to play him since we sort of leveled out the existing hard points and such. I still need to play the hard points from a couple of years ago when we had the last, weekend in Shattered Empires, because inevitably I've been playing with my home group, the ARG crowd,
Hmm.
and playing the 5e adventures with people through Discord. Matthew of Perth has been very active running tables for people. I mentioned John Deeg from Australia. He's very actively playing online. I've played with Peter a
Hmm.
number of times. So I've really been able to find second life playing online with people from other areas since we don't have so much of a 5e crowd here.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting because I'm in Brooklyn and it seems to be only a 5e crowd, but that's just because it's trendy and these are the younger than hipster kids that are getting into it. So tell me about playing on Discord, right? As I've stepped away, and one of the things I'm looking at now is how to integrate more. And
Mhm.
online play definitely seems to be predominant post COVID, and I've been playing via Zoom, and I'm going to tell you, it seems like there's a whole bunch of other ways to do it. So, what's discourse like? How does it work?
So Discord is somewhat akin to the old Yahoo groups. A lot of the chat rooms, have moved there, like the campaign discourse and, news is had on the Discord server, and they've got sections for scheduling tables for online play. Usually we use OpenRPG table software. It's been a hot minute, so I'm a bit out of practice, but I think they just had Adventure, run this last weekend.
Hmm.
If you just look in the looking for group section, they'll, schedule things like once a month or so.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it. I mean, like I said, I just getting back in, starting with this to ramp up for Origins, and I'm just kind of getting my head around how things like Discord works and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So, you're doing fifth edition online. You have a home ARG that's sporadic. What's next? Are you headed to Origins? What do
I,
you?
I absolutely am. I'm going to be there with the Denver crew. Our numbers are slightly reduced, due to COVID and, people falling off,
Hmm.
from the campaign over time. But we've still got a core group of 4 or 5 guys that are going to be there repping our party.
Yeah.
I'm going to see what I can do to, fit in a bunch of 5e while I'm there.
Hmm.
We'll see
Well,
how
I'm
the
gonna be running just intro stuff, and then the battle interactive, which I'm sure I'll be just doing low level tables because that's about my comfort level right now.
for
Just
sure.
that. So awesome. I'll look for you there, man. We'll have to hang out and share more stories, and we'll spread the good word of Arcanus. So thanks for
I'd
joining
be
me. I
delighted.
appreciate it very much.
Yeah. If you ever get around to, covering the ARG era stuff, I'd be happy to tell you about my character there.
We'll get to that. But I want to get people, because, right, we're trying to
Oh yeah,
push fifth edition right now. But we will. All right,
sure.
man. Take care. I appreciate it.
And the Invisible Kings will be happy to, share
Oh,
about
yeah, yeah. To really
his.
talk about just how much this publisher embraces the fans' participation. The players' participation is always it's absolutely one of the things that makes this company stand out.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up.
When I, lost Reagan to, NPC status, I threw myself fully into volunteering and GMing,
Hmm.
at the conventions, try and give back for
Yeah.
all the
Everything
things
you
that,
got, all the fun times.
yeah,
All right, man. Appreciate it. Have a good night.
you too.
All right, bye.
Bye.